Good evening and welcome. My name is Warren Klein, and on behalf of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, I am delighted to welcome you to a conversation that reminds us that the political and social divides among us are hardly new. Before I do, I want to invite you to join us during an extremely busy week here at the Streicker Center, with guests such as Andy Cohen, Mitch Albom, Henry Kissinger, Kristen Hanna, and so many more. Please check our website, streicker.nyc, for more info. Now to tonight's program. Artists have always pushed against the boundaries of social acceptability and provoked backlash. Commissioned to paint a Virgin Mary for a Roman chapel in the early 17th century, Caravaggio so horrified the church with his depiction of Mary as lifeless, swollen, and unkempt that they rejected the painting. Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, his Cubist portrait of 5 women in a brothel, caused so much outrage that after its first showing, the painter kept it hidden for several years. And let's not forget what happened to Robert Mapplethorpe, mounted a photo exhibition that included explicit S&M content at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington. Members of Congress worked themselves into a lather, threatening to withhold federal funding of the gallery, which then canceled the exhibition, which of course provoked a counter-protest. In the art world, at least, cancel culture has long been with us. Tonight's guests join us to discuss a more recent controversy that rocked New York, a showdown between the Brooklyn Museum of Art, defended by a who's who of American artists, and Mayor Rudy Giuliani, egged on by the New York Daily News. We are honored to revisit the storm over the Black Madonna at this particularly opportune moment, with the man at its center, Arnold Lehman, the museum's fearless director, and Floyd Abrams, our nation's leading First Amendment attorney. Mr. Lehman spent 20 years building the Baltimore Museum of Art before taking over at the Brooklyn Museum, a position he held for 18 years. He is currently a senior advisor at Phillips Auction House. Floyd Abrams has represented dozens of journalists and media outlets, including the New York Times, during the Pentagon paper case. He is currently senior counsel at Cahill, Gordon, and Rangel. Please join me in welcoming Arnold Lehman and Floyd Abrams.
Thank you very much, Warren. First, I want to quickly thank the Streicker Center for inviting both of us this evening to talk about sensation, and particularly to thank Floyd Abrams for his willingness to join me in doing so, and to talk about the exhibition that recalls the continuing relevance of the books today. But indeed, we wouldn't be here at all if it weren't for Floyd.
Well, I want to welcome all of you myself with a special welcome. Today is an anniversary. It's the 22nd anniversary to the day of the decision of Judge Nina Gershon of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn, that ruled in favor of the Brooklyn Museum, which essentially allowed it to continue to choose its own art, and allowed it as well to avoid any of the many sanctions that the Giuliani regime were trying to impose upon it in an effort to pressure it to drop one particular painting of which the mayor particularly disapproved. We'll talk a little bit later about the case, but I just wanted to read you one line from Judge Gershon's opinion, because I think it is alive today as it was then. She wrote, "There is no federal constitutional issue more grave than the effort of government officials to censor works of expression and to threaten the vitality of a major cultural institution as punishment for failing to abide by government demands for orthodoxy." That's what the case was about. That's why it mattered then. That's why it matters now. And I'll have more to say about it later. But let's start off the evening, if I may, by a question to Arnold Lehman. It's 22 years since these events occurred. Why write a book? Why write a book now about these events?
Well, Floyd, good question. First of all, I was, despite many efforts to the contrary, I was still director of the Brooklyn Museum until 2015, and I certainly thought it was inappropriate to write a book of this nature while I was director. It took me several years to pull everything together, and then we were in the middle or the beginning of the Trump administration. And I was beginning to see clear evidence among my colleagues in educational institutions in which I'm involved that people began to be quiet. They began to practice self-censorship. And I became very worried that we were entering a period that Judge Gershon was writing about. And so I decided now or never, and I determined to write the book then. And with the help from the Ford Foundation, which helped me with research and editorial assistance, the book was finally produced. So I was delighted to do so. And this evening, what I would like to do is to begin to provide somewhat of a visual setting for sensation, which might bring back some memories of people watching us online tonight. The book itself covers a 6-month period from September 1999 to March 2000, while I was director of the Brooklyn Museum. In short, the book is about a brief but truly impossibly turbulent, but indeed supremely meaningful episode in my more than 40-year career as an art museum director. The next slide, please. The next slide. Up.
Sorry, just one moment.
Okay, sorry. Having a little bit of visual problem. Not good for a museum director. Well, I'll just talk a little bit more while we're getting the slides up. There we go. Well, that's the book I mentioned before, which just was published. But if I could have the next slide, please. The exhibition sensation was certainly also a critical moment for museums and libraries and all cultural and educational organizations, certainly, but whose missions were all born in and nurtured on and protected by the First Amendment right to the freedom of expression, about which we're speaking this evening. And as Floyd recounted, we would all be affected by the outcome of Brooklyn's 6-month journey through our federal court system. The title of the art exhibition that I brought to the Brooklyn Museum, if I could have the next slide, please, in 1999 was Sensation, Young British Artists from a Saatchi Collection. It was organized by London's Royal Academy and featured the YBAs, Young British Artists, then the UK's certainly most avant-garde artists. And all were from the collection of Charles Saatchi, Britain's most important contemporary collector at the time. As director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, just prior to Brooklyn, I had been working on an enormous exhibition of treasures from the Victoria Albert Museum in London. With over 30 trips to London, I had become immersed in its existing and very exciting contemporary art scene in the 1990s. As soon as I heard about Sensation, I seized the opportunity for Brooklyn. One painting on the next slide. No, we're a little bit behind. Okay, but anyway, one more, please. There we go. On the rear wall of this gallery, you can see the one painting at the Royal Academy, which caused the sensation exhibition in London to become a huge controversy. It was this enormous portrait by the artist Marcus Harvey, made with the plaster casts of children's hands, of Myra Hindley, called the Moor's Murderer, who was an infamous serial murderer of children in the 1960s. While Myra, without his backstory, went without notice in Brooklyn, the exhibition's other works would be new, exciting, and often very provocative here in New York, such as you see on the screen, the Chapman brothers' sculpture of children with genitals in all the wrong places, or this called Dead Dad, a half-sized nude male figure by Ron Mueck of his deceased father, or this self-portrait in the artist's own Frozen Blood by Mark Quinn. And perhaps most astonishing to visitors were the works of Damien Hirst, such as this ferocious shark encased in hundreds of gallons of formaldehyde, or this sliced cow in a dozen sections, again in formaldehyde-filled cases. But perhaps because of the mostly negative media, I witnessed thousands of young visitors and visitors of color in line every day to see sensation at the Royal Academy. Visitors who were unusual for the Royal Academy. And here in Brooklyn, back up, please. The slide before that. Yeah. And here in Brooklyn, lines were up to 5 hours in length. Next slide. However, there was a totally unexpected painting in the exhibition that set off, as you can see in this front page of the Daily News, of a firestorm that reverberated around the world through an avalanche of frenzied media. 2 decades ago, there was no internet, but the story of sensation was on the front pages of every newspaper and constantly on television and radio month after month. The painting I was referring to was the Holy Virgin Mary, beautifully crafted and almost glowing with reverence by a young Anglo-Nigerian artist, Chris O'Feely. O'Feely often used dried balls of shellacked and intricately decorated elephant dung in his work, a reference to his African roots, where the material was considered healing and life-giving. O'Feely used a ball of elephant dung to represent one of the Madonna's breasts, again referring to the life-affirming nature of the material and of the Virgin Mary herself. He also used cutouts of female buttocks on the painting resembling putti. And the almost life-size painting, instead of hanging on the wall, rested against it on 2 elegantly detailed feet of elephant dung. 2 elderly white nuns visiting the exhibition introduced themselves to me and whispered how beautiful and reverent the painting was to them. That unforgettable moment helped me put aside the death threats, the bomb threats, and the attacks in the street, on the subway, and especially in the press. The first media explosion came after the Daily News published a highly inflammatory piece about the show 3 weeks before it opened, with neither the reporter nor anyone from the newspaper ever having seen the exhibition itself. It was headlined, "Brooklyn Gallery of Horror, Gruesome Museum Show Stirs Controversy." And I'm quoting from the story. The R-rated show is sparking outrage over such works as a painting of the Virgin Mary splattered with elephant dung, which of course it was not, but it still infuriated thousands of its more religious readers. Here you see the huge demonstrations outside the museum, both pro and con, and hourly coverage of the exhibition on cable news. But the most serious threat came from the then mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, who was in an undeclared New York Senate race against Hillary Clinton, and who never saw the exhibition from beginning to end, but who said that the Ophelia offended him and that it was sick and disgusting, that the museum had to remove the painting of the Holy Virgin Mary from the exhibition, or he would, as Floyd said, demand that the exhibition be canceled. And in short order, Giuliani removed $7 million in city operating funds and $35 million in capital funding from the museum. He then tried to replace the museum's obviously out of control board of trustees and, quoting Giuliani, its senseless director, and to evict the museum from its city-owned century-long home, which surely would have been the most spectacular lawn sale in the history of lawn sales. All this supposedly over one painting. However, it was a painting about which the publisher of the Amsterdam News, the largest Black-owned and run newspaper in the country, wrote, "A Black Madonna, Giuliani's worst nightmare." The major New York papers, including every one of them, constantly attacked the museum with false statements that had already almost entirely been thrown out by the federal district court. Represented by present today, he doesn't mind if I say, the great First Amendment lawyer, Floyd Abrams, and with the unanimous support of the museum's extraordinary board of trustees, the Brooklyn Museum sued the city of New York and Giuliani, both in his capacity of mayor and personally in federal court. Maybe this is just the right time, Floyd, for you to jump in here to talk about the lawsuit itself.
Sure. Well, with these threats that Arnold has referred to escalated. First, it was, we're going to defund you unless you take the picture down. Then it was, you ought to shut your doors, and we're going to make you do that unless you take the picture down. And then they came upon what the lawyers for the city obviously thought was a softer, easier, less First Amendment sounding argument. And what was that? That the museum has a lease with the city, and the lease said that all people ought to be allowed in to the museum. But the mayor's people said, that's not happening, because the museum has already announced that no one under 17 would be allowed in the museum unless there was parental consent. So the argument went, this museum is supposed to be open, and it's not really open because of its provisions about children. You can gather already the irony in that argument. Here was the mayor saying this was awful, harmful, destructive, non-art. But when the museum said we won't let children in by themselves, the answer was not, well, at least they're doing that. No, the answer was, well, that breaches the lease. So we had to do a lot of thinking about how to proceed, how to think about defending the Brooklyn Museum as these threats grew in amount. And after leaders, representatives of the mayor came to the museum and made demands that the Ophelia painting come down in particular, we thought that there was nothing else to do but to go to court, and that we didn't want the court proceeding to be one of the things the city was threatening, an ejectment proceeding, to throw them out of their where they were in that great structure on Eastern Parkway. We wanted it to be about the First Amendment. And so we brought a lawsuit. We filed it 5 to 5 in the afternoon of the day that the mayor's representatives were at the museum to try to be in court first. And we were. It was assigned to Judge Gershon. We had hearings quickly in front of her. My partner, Susan Buckley, in particular, was involved taking the deposition of the individual who would have been in charge of setting standards for art. And he wound up unprepared and essentially saying he had an 8-year-old daughter, and the standard he would use is, would he want her to see that these works? So much for art, so much for museums. So we appeared in front of Judge Gershon. We argued at length in front of her. She wrote an opinion which was a complete victory for our side, enjoining the city and personally enjoining the mayor from taking any steps against this museum that he wasn't taking against all the other museums, and joining them from violating the First Amendment in anything that they were doing, such as the things we've already talked about. Remember that the stripping of funding was, as Arnold said, already occurring. So her opinion came down. The city appealed. There was an argument in the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, in which a critical moment was that Judge John Newman asked the lawyer for the city, and I'm quoting, "Is it really the position of the city that the Brooklyn Museum should take all of its art and move out of the building? Is that what you're saying?" And the answer that was given was yes, that is our position. We never got a ruling from the Second Circuit because a week or two after that argument, which I think went well from our perspective, I got a call from the mayor's chief counsel saying that they were prepared to talk settlement. And we basically reached a settlement, which was a complete withdrawal by the city of all the things it had been saying, withdrawal in the sense that they agreed not to treat the museum differently from any other museum, in the sense that it bound Rudolph Giuliani personally, not just the city of New York, from doing a variety of things, the sort of things that he had threatened to do. And so the case ended. I should add only one other thing, and that is that when Judge Gershon's opinion came down, the mayor publicly said of a federal judge, of her, that she was, quote, intellectually dishonest, unquote, totally out of control, lost all reason, these are all quotes, and part of the politically correct left wing of New York City. I later said in an interview by the New York Times that he was a lucky man he didn't live in England, because he'd be in jail for contempt of court. In any event, the case ended. We got all we wanted by way of legal protection, and I'll turn it back to Arnold now.
Thank you, Floyd. I was reliving almost every moment of those court hearings, which made me very nervous at first, but not after you got up to speak. So I will be eternally grateful to you, as should everyone in the city of New York. However, one person obviously wasn't listening during these court hearings, because not having the benefit of hearing Floyd on the subject of the First Amendment, only a few weeks before the exhibition closed, a deranged elderly man attacked. Can we go back, go down one, please? Next slide. Yes, thank you. A deranged elderly man attacked the Ophelia painting, literally trying to whitewash over the Black Virgin Mary. As Floyd said in March 2000, almost 6 months to the date sensation opened, Giuliani offered to settle the case. But during those 6 months, the Brooklyn Museum most certainly became the most talked about museum in the world. And next slide. And we all know what's happening with Rudy today. Next slide, please. More of the story, I would leave now to Floyd's questions and then to questions from our audience. So, Floyd?
Well, why don't we start with you and sensation? How and where did you first come upon the Sensation exhibition, and what did you think of it then?
Well, I actually came upon the catalog first, and I must have read, I think I stayed up all night reading the catalog and devouring all of the images in it, many of which I knew. I certainly knew the artists because I would frequently go to Charles Saatchi's private museum in London, where he did shows one after the other of the young British artists. I met them at other galleries. They were really, no one talked about anything else. And when the Sensation exhibition actually first opened at the Royal Academy, I didn't have a chance to see it, but I knew everything that was in it. And I was absolutely certain that for our show to begin the new millennium at the Brooklyn Museum, this should be the exhibition that we start with. And I never expected the reaction, clearly, that we got.
Well, that's what I was about to ask you. What, if anything, surprised you in terms of the reaction to it?
I think, Floyd, it was the vehemence of the reaction. You rarely see a front page of a city newspaper, New York City newspaper, devoted to a work of art. I wish they would more often. But cover after cover, whether it was Newsday or the Daily News or the New York Post, and every day there was not one or two, but sometimes 3 and 4 and 5 articles in each newspaper decrying the painting, saying how badly the museum was run. And it was unpredictable. We thought we might have some provocative, there was some provocative works of art in the exhibition, but we never thought that the Chris Ophelia was going to be the target.
What do you think the view would be today, the reaction would be today, if this Sensation exhibition were shown again at the Brooklyn Museum?
Well, in one sense, I think the reaction would be much calmer. People may still criticize the exhibition for the value of the works of art themselves, the aesthetic value of the works of art themselves. But I think the newspapers and the electronic media would not have taken this on as a battle, which they did. We received newspaper clippings from around the world, from India, from South America, from South Africa. Every newspaper in the world had picked up on it then. Today, I think they would not be doing so.
I was surprised, but I came to it with no great knowledge about this. But And I'm wondering, looking back on it, if you were at the lack of support that you received from the great New York City museums, Metropolitan Art, MoMA. They were not to be heard, except in some sense in their criticism. Is that a correct statement?
I think that's entirely correct. And it was both institutionally and personally very upsetting. But there was a reason behind all of that, not a good enough reason not to support and artistic decisions on the part of another institution, even if perhaps you didn't approve of them yourself. But both the Metropolitan Museum and the Museum of Modern Art were promised considerable sums of support by the mayor previously to this situation coming about. And since the museum was attacked so forcefully by the mayor, and not only was a subsidy to our operating funds removed, but our capital funding was removed, I'm sure the Museum of Modern Art was concerned about the $65 million gift, which the mayor had promised them. And I believe at that point, the Metropolitan Museum was getting a total of $45 million or $50 million. Museums can't easily replace that kind of money. And so they remained quiet. I have to give credit to my colleague, Glenn Lowry, from the Museum of Modern Art, who did finally embrace the idea of the new and of artists having new visions and new creations, and said in an article or an op-ed piece in the New York Times that what the city was doing was wrong. So, but the silence in New York City from the other cultural institutions was deafening.
I had the sense as well. I mean, I'll never forget the Philippe de Montebello's piece, the director of the Met, criticizing the art and saying it's not real art at a time when the museum, your museum, was at peril.
Can I just fast forward that
Sure.
for a moment, Floyd, because I think you know the answer to this. You may remember. First of all, the really spectacular Holy Virgin Mary by Chris O'Feely is now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. So in that sense, Glenn was obviously correct. They outbid us for the painting. But more amazingly, I was taken on a tour by Philippe to see the great Damien Hirst shark in the galleries, the beautiful galleries at the Metropolitan Museum, where it was a loan for several years from its owner. And at that point, Philippe was very enthusiastic about it. I guess maybe it's a question of where the art lives that makes it important or not important.
Let's come back to the Brooklyn Museum. Looking at it now, you're no longer there. What's your view as to the impact of the whole controversy now on the Brooklyn Museum? What happened to or from the museum after it?
Well, Floyd, one of the reasons that I was very attracted to come to the Brooklyn Museum, not only was it the museum of my childhood, but it also is a museum that had done really groundbreaking things in contemporary art over the years. And I thought that, and the trustees of the museum hoped that it would take a leadership position once again in contemporary art. And that certainly has happened. We continued to take great chances. I think, along with our great friends at the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Brooklyn Museum was at the forefront of showing work by African American artists. It always had for decades, but at the forefront in the last 2 decades of showing the important work being done by African American artists, which was almost unknown to museum goers throughout the country. And not only does it continue to do so, but it continues to really be a leader in bringing to the public the most avant-garde artists and communities of color who had not gotten their fair share of audience engagement.
Today, if there were another controversy not involving Brooklyn Museum or you, do you think that the great museums, that the leaders of the most powerful and influential museums might be more protective or not?
Well, I'm really too old to comment on this, but I think the world has changed so dramatically with the internet and with social media that there would be so many voices being heard, loud voices being heard, that the few voices, the affirming voices of our art museum colleagues would not be probably as important. And even in a sense, when this happened, we just read newspapers. We got our news from the newspapers and from TV news and from the radio. Cable was in its infancy. We remember my wife was addicted to New York One because it showed something about the Brooklyn Museum every hour on the hour, just a hint of what was going on, and then a full story every single hour of the day. So I think support, affirmation, or vilification would be coming from different quarters. But there would so many voices today that would be really interesting to see what would happen.
Have there been any significant areas of controversy with respect to other museums since your ordeal?
Well, in a fashion, we almost had closed out what we thought were the culture wars. But I think the most recent controversy took place about a Philip Guston exhibition that was supposed to premiere at the National Gallery of Art. And a lot of questions were raised before it opened about whether his work was pro or anti Blacks in the community. If I remember correctly, and this was a couple of years ago, there wasn't an African-American curator working on this project. And I think that the museums involved were very concerned about moving forward, and they postponed the show. And I think that's part of whether they did the right thing or the wrong thing, I'm not judging, but it is part of what I think has happened in our profession, in the world of university education. People don't want to rock the boat. And while that's certainly not always good, I think that, and I've always said this, as others have, that museums should be safe places for unsafe ideas. And I've tried always to think of that as my guidepost. And I've certainly, we went right into a year later, we did this major exhibition of 100 African-American photographers. And because one of the photographers, a woman photographer, showed herself as a nude Jesus at the Last Supper, had we not had that injunction, Floyd, that you so skillfully argued for, we would probably have been back in the same situation as we had with sensation. So I think it's been quieter, but not necessarily for the right reasons.
As you look back on it all, do you have any regrets about anything, anything to do with the exhibition?
Well, let me say that, let me just take a step back for a moment. Several months before the exhibition opened at the Brooklyn Museum, before Sensation opened, Bob Rubin, the chairman of our board, and I finally had gotten a meeting with the mayor, with Mayor Giuliani, to talk to him about money to help support capital funding, to help support the renovation of our rather formidable entrance. And that meeting occurred on July 14, which any Francophile would immediately say is Bastille Day. We presented what the museum was doing in general. I presented what we thought to be the most provocative works in the Sensation exhibition, calling upon the hundreds and hundreds of pages of press that we'd gotten sent to us from the Royal Academy. So I didn't show the Chrysophilia Holy Virgin Mary. At the end of that meeting, the mayor patted me on the back, shook Bob's hand, and turned to his lieutenants and said, "Give them what they want. They're good guys." That is a voice that has rung in my ears for years. And I said to myself, what would have happened had I, being a more perhaps thorough museum director, showed all of those objects, including the Holy Virgin Mary? Would we have had a knockdown argument right there? Would the mayor have thrown us out of his office? Or would we have had an argument that would have resolved this?
You think the mayor would have known there was elephant dung?
I would have explained it. If I was going to bring it forward, I would have explained it. But that political race, which we shouldn't overlook, the mayor needed to appeal to upstate conservative voters and conservative voters elsewhere, because by then, until 9/11, I don't think many people in New York City would have voted for Rudy Giuliani for another to become senator. So I probably would have, should have, could have, what's that expression, shown that work then. It may have been an entirely different situation afterwards. So that's my main regret.
Right. I want to save time for questions from our audience. Let me just ask you a last one. Would you do it again?
Absolutely. I think, as I said before, about museum being safe spaces, but I also think that leaders of cultural institutions, of all institutions, and the curators in charge, and we all have to do the right thing. and we can't be afraid of the consequences of doing the right thing. So yes, I would have done it again. I would have trusted my response to seeing those paintings all over London in the catalog. And I would have been very proud to present Sensation at the Brooklyn Museum.
Well, thank you. I want to give
Yes.
opportunity for questions to be asked of you that have been flowing across our screen. I'll pass the ball to whoever's going to ask those to you.
Okay. Hi, Arnold. Quite a few questions. It's been quite lively. So I'll first start with Lorraine's question. She wanted to know what your writing process was like to put this book together.
Well, before I say a word about my writing process, I want to give credit to my wife. Without my knowing, for the entirety of Sensation, she took copious notes, day by day, sometimes hour by hour, to record everything that went on, because knowing me for those many years, she knew, one, I would forget. I would put them aside in the desk drawer that I couldn't find. And when I finally decided to write this book, she presented me with 98 pages of single space typed in a very small type pages of notes. And it was from that, and it was from the thousands of newspaper clippings that she kept and recordings of radio and television shows. Every television in our house, every radio was on all day long. It was just a cacophony. I sometimes had to go into the hallway to take a telephone call. But without that, I could not have written this book. And I want to thank her for it.
That's wonderful. Okay, question from Denise. Having read about this back in the day, she wants to know if you have any ideas for other stories to write. Maybe your next book, maybe you're working on something right now, or things that have occurred in other institutions that might be of interest.
I have to say, although something might happen to change that, I'm taking a break from writing for a while. But I do have a few ideas. I think it's important for someone to talk about the issues that Floyd and I have been discussing and how they're affecting museums today. And I just see it so often that it's quite disheartening. So maybe a book would be an outlet or a protective shield of some kind for our museums to move forward. They are doing great work, and sometimes against very great difficulties.
Great, thank you. Jay wanted to know, what was the artist's reaction to the violent response to his work? And did any other artists in the exhibition come to his defense?
Well, it was fascinating. Chris O'Feely is not, I don't know him well, but he at that time said something that really spoke to me in an article in the New York Times written by Carol Vogel. And he said that the people who are criticizing this painting are criticizing their own values that they put forward into this painting. They're not criticizing what I think. They're not criticizing what I tried to do in this painting. And he really didn't want to comment any further about it. I think it was very hurtful. And he was a practicing Catholic and was very upset about how the religious nature of this work was clearly either offending people or being used for political purposes.
A couple people wanted to know, what is Chris Ofili up to today? How is he regarded as an artist? And did the controversy help or hurt his career?
Well, I don't think the controversy hurt any of the careers of the artists who were in sensation. First of all, they were all truly extraordinary creators. They all were doing great work, and some of their best work was being shown in sensation. Charles Saatchi had a terrific eye. Chris Ofili is doing splendidly. He has one exhibition after another. He had won the Turner Prize, which is the major prize giving to contemporary artists in Great Britain. And I think he is heavily collected and extremely well regarded, as are scores of the other artists in sensation. So I'm very glad to know they're all doing well.
Great. Do you have a question from someone, from Teresa, for Floyd? How did you come to defend the museum? Floyd, what was your research for the case like in terms of First Amendment rights and city-funded venues?
Well, it wasn't a hard choice for me to say yes when I was asked to represent the museum. It's true that there were not a whole lot of cases. Maybe this is a good thing. Maybe it's a sign that there isn't that much censorship of museums, at least which gets into court. So there were a lot, not a lot of authorities directly on point. And I guess I should throw into the hopper that one of the arguments I would say that some scholars have said that they thought the Giuliani team should have argued more with was that in the area of funding, that basically the courts shouldn't get involved. That a decision not to fund can be made on all sorts of bases, and that we shouldn't be wheeling the First Amendment in there. The problem with that argument, I think, is that we're really talking about a situation here in which the money was already appropriated. So we're not talking about some mayor saying, all I want is representational art. No court's going to strike that down. If New York City wanted to have only in a museum funded by the city, pictures of the city, no one would say that violates the First Amendment. But coming in after the fact, aiming at a picture and aiming at it not really at all on artistic grounds, but call it what you will, political grounds. And I've left out, we haven't mentioned really yet, religious grounds. Mayor Giuliani never stopped talking, perhaps for political reasons, but reasons aside, never stopped talking about how this was an insult to Catholics, and said that the museum owed it to Catholics to take it down because it was offensive to them. Judge Gershon dealt with that very strongly. I don't have her language in front of me, but really made a finding that this not only violated the First Amendment for the more obvious reasons that we've been talking about, but because it violated the freedom of religion clauses. That it was the state stepping in and saying, for religious reasons, you couldn't take that picture. You couldn't leave that picture up, even though no one could have argued. No one could have argued. And even the Giuliani administration didn't argue that the Ofili work, and indeed everything else that the museum had in this sensation exhibit, was on its face protected by the First Amendment. So there was this additional religious angle, which of course had a political side to it, and also had the potential to make sort of reasoned debate about it all the more difficult, as if, and I think this was the case, Mayor Giuliani was turning the switch as high as he could to create outrage against the museum and its exhibition.
Thank you. Floyd, I wonder if we have another question for you. From Randall, have you had any other cases like this around controversial museum exhibitions, or perhaps dealing with any museums at all in your career?
You know, I don't think so. And I say that indefinitely because I followed the Cincinnati Museum case with the Mapplethorpe works very closely. And I could have done an amicus brief in that case. But the narrow answer is no, I have not had other museum clients, so to speak, that had problems and came to me.
Thank you. Question from Marcy. What happened to the man that destroyed the painting? Were there guards nearby?
And may I add to that question another one that I see came in, which I'm interested in. How did they do the work to restore the painting?
Thank you. That was the follow-up.
Yes, the painting was very well protected. It had a giant shield of plexiglass in front of it, a number of feet in front of it, and there was a guard right there. It was the only painting in the exhibition that had a guard standing there all the time. The man in question pretended to have a heart attack, and the guard, as he should, was concerned about him and went to get him a chair and some water and to call for help. And at that moment, he's kind of slithered behind the small opening between the plexiglass and the wall. And he had come through our metal detectors, which we hadn't in place to begin with, but we put in place because of the bomb threats. He had put white paint in a plastic container so it would not be caught by the metal detectors, took out the container, sprayed it all over the face and the upper portion of the Virgin Mary. When we called, fortunately, our conservators were only one floor away and in their laboratories, and they rushed down, took the painting off the wall immediately, and set to work cleaning the wet paint off of the surface. The key here, Floyd, was that the paint was wet, and they were able to take off what they viewed as 99.98 or 9% of the paint. You can still see under a microscope some flecks of white paint, but the painting was back on the wall the next day. Oh. Had we removed that painting, we felt, and I remember talking to you about this, the mayor would have won because the painting was gone from the exhibition, one way or the other. It was gone. And clearly, the elderly man who did this did it out of outrage. He also, from what our information was, he also attacked abortion clinics. And so the only penalty he got was a pat on the hand.
So I'm afraid we just have time for one more question. It's a good one, though, I think, from Mark. What advice would you give to young or emerging artists who are facing backlash to their work or the focus of their art?
Well, it depends what the backlash is. I would say, flippantly, that they were probably doing the right thing if they were getting that much backlash. I think, artists are a different species than you and I, and they need to be protected. They need to be nurtured because they tell us about the world, that the world we can't see and we don't observe and we don't understand as well as they do. And as we all know, it's not the politics, it's not these arguments that become part of the story of our civilization. It's the art and the architecture that tell us about what past civilizations were thinking about and doing. So I would urge them to stay the course and do their best. And again, always make a decision based on what was right. And to hire Floyd Abrams if they ever needed an extraordinary attorney.
Arnold, we ought to do more of these things.
Well, please join me in thanking Arnold Lehman and Floyd Abrams. Thank you both so much for being here virtually tonight, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.